Hello and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Easy Does It, Non-Action in the Lao Tzu. The square in front of the main building of the LMU here in Munich is named after Sophie Scholl and her brother Hans. In 1943, they were among a group of dissidents who distributed pamphlets at the university denouncing the Nazi dictatorship. This brave action had the result you might expect. They were arrested and executed. Not apparently an event that could have much to do with classical Chinese philosophy, but as it turns out, the pamphlets distributed by the Scholl siblings and their group, the White Rose, quoted from two chapters of the Lao Tzu, namely chapters 29 and 58. One of the chapters from which they quoted reads in part, "The empire is a spiritual thing and should not be acted on. He who acts on it harms it. He who holds on to it loses it." So here we are, only about a minute into our latest podcast on the Lao Tzu, and we already have another paradox. The Scholls and their young friends have gone down in history as heroes for their courageous actions, yet they cited a passage that celebrates the key Taoist tenet of non-action, or wuwei. It's a paradox at the heart of the Lao Tzu, many of whose passages tell us that we will act best by not acting, and best accomplish goals by not pursuing them. Here's a selection of 4 such passages taken from chapters 2, 43, 47, and 64. The sage manages affairs without action, and spreads doctrines without words. All things arise, and he does not turn away from them. He produces them, but does not take possession of them. Few in the world can understand teaching without words and the advantage of taking no action. The further one goes, the less one knows. Therefore, the sage knows without going about, understands without seeing, and accomplishes without any action. He who takes an action fails. He who grasps things loses them. For this reason, the sage takes no action and therefore does not fail. You get the general idea. Or do you? How could it make sense to say that the best course of action is no action at all? Would the authors of the Lao Tzu say that the activists of the White Rose were making a fundamental mistake because you can't be an activist without acting? Should they instead have done nothing when confronted with fascist evil? How could that possibly have helped them to achieve worthwhile goals? The confounding nature of wuwei makes it a perfect fit for the contrarian and apparently self-undermining text that is the Lao Tzu. Yet it's a concept invoked in other warring states' texts too. We find works in praise of rulers that celebrate them for their gentle approach, like an ode from the classic of poetry, which says of King Xuan, "He received the blessing of heaven, he was not forceful, not pressing, not hard nor soft. He spread his government in gentle harmony, and all the blessings of heaven he combined in his person." The Confucian Analects mentions wuwei explicitly in a passage we cited in episodes 12 and 19. The great sage King Shun needed only to make himself reverent and sit facing south in order to run the kingdom well. The fact that he faces south connects this remark to a comparison found elsewhere in the Analects. The virtuous ruler is likened to the pole star, which is of course furthest north and thus faces everything else to the south. Like the star, the ideal king remains perfectly still as everything else revolves around him. This may be understood as a Confucian take on wuwei. When we talked about these passages, we considered a couple of possible interpretations. One idea was that the good king should simply choose good advisors, namely Confucian scholars, and let them do everything for him. Another reading would give more weight to the virtue and reverence of these ideal inactive kings. In a sense, they are, after all, doing something, namely being paragons of virtue. They can transform the people around them, ultimately even the whole population, simply with the force of their personalities. But this notion that the ruler may refrain from action because he accomplishes everything by being a good role model is rejected by the Lao Tzu. The best rulers are those whose existence is merely known by the people. The next best are those who are loved and praised, the next are those who are feared, and the next are those who are despised. The Confucian ruler could perhaps fall into the second category of those who are loved and praised, It's not a bad plan, but still only plan B. The Taoist's perfect ruler is not a role model to be imitated, but to the contrary, hidden and unknown. We should imagine the people walking past his palace, knowing he's in there, but wondering what he looks like and what he may be doing. The answer to which is, apparently, nothing. By being hidden and unknown, the perfect ruler is like Tao itself. Like the nameless Tao, which has sometimes been read as an ineffable source of all existence, the concept of wuwei is open to a cosmological interpretation. On this approach, the Lao Tzu recommends wuwei because Tao is more an absence than a presence. As we saw, Chapter 11 compares Tao to the emptiness of a clay pot or the gaps between the spokes of a wheel, and we might also think of all that talk about valleys and ravines, more negative spaces. This fascination with emptiness could have to do with a basic metaphysical assumption, namely that the cosmos, everything that is, must have at some point not existed. We saw that Chapter 40 can be used to interpret the nameless Tao. All things arise from being, and being arises from non-being. Here the word translated as non-being is wu, which is the same word as the negation in the term wu wei. As a standalone term, wu in the Lao Tzu contrasts with you, which is often thought of as referring to existence. Apart from interpreting the wu-yo contrast as having metaphysical connotations, there is another way to understand the pair. This is to see wu and yo as words that we use to refer to things. Yo refers to the things we perceive and give labels to. Wu refers to whatever we do not understand or take notice of, and to which we have not given any names. In either case, adopting wu wei would be to make oneself more obscure, like the unnamed origin of all things. That might seem like a pretty strange mission in life, but it fits with a lot of other ideas in the Lao Tzu. For example, its talk of cultivating feminine passivity in imitation of the Tao. While these practices are meant to produce good results, that happens incidentally. Being like Tao is meant to be its own reward. In keeping with this, Chapter 25 explicitly speaks of the ruler imitating the Tao, albeit indirectly. He should model himself on the earth, which models itself on heaven, and heaven models itself on Tao. Still, one would like to know what this emulation of the nameless Tao actually looks like in concrete political terms. Are we meant to imagine that the ruler literally never does anything, like Shun, sitting still and facing south? There are passages that suggest so, for example this one. The pursuit of learning is to increase day after day. The pursuit of Tao is to decrease day after day. It is to decrease and further decrease until one reaches the point of taking no action. No action is undertaken, and yet nothing is left undone. An empire is often brought to order by having no activity. This looks like another criticism of the Confucians, or more generally, scholars and intellectuals who are obsessed with learning and with knowledge. A paradigmatic case would be Kongtsu's long years of study, as recorded in his famous autobiographical remark, in which he set his mind upon learning at age 15. For the Lao Tzu, this is a mistake, or at least not the best path to follow. Rather than memorizing thousands of poems and learning to carry out hundreds of rituals, one should learn to do nothing. Perhaps the authors of the Lao Tzu are making the same complaint that one sometimes hears today, that even well-meaning governments and leaders always make things worse. And there could well be some exaggeration here, given that the aim is to try to debunk the opponent's views. Proponents of small government would like the ruling class to just get out of the people's way and let them run their own affairs. In warring states China, that would have been a very plausible conclusion to draw. The sage kings of old were excellent stewards of their states, but all the rulers in living memory were tin-pot dictators, whose people would have been better off if they never got out of bed. We've seen this same idea, albeit in a more limited form, in the Moists. When it comes to waging war and putting on expensive funerals, they too were in favor of non-action. But of course, the Moists did want their rulers to act in other ways, as by ensuring there is sufficient food for the people, which seems eminently reasonable. It's a counsel of despair to tell the ruler to do literally nothing. This would only make sense if the ruler were so incompetent and vicious that any action he might conceivably take would be counterproductive. Modern interpreters have thus tended to understand the doctrine of wuwei not as recommending total inaction, but as advising against actions of a certain kind. And there's a lot of good evidence for this in the Lao Tzu. At the start of this episode, we quoted Chapter 2 and its statement that the sage manages affairs without action. The chapter goes on to say that the sage acts but does not rely on his own ability. He accomplishes his task but does not claim credit for it. Similarly, Chapter 9 recommends withdraw as soon as your work is done, which seems to imply that you have been doing some work. Finally, Chapter 63 says, in typically riddling fashion, act without action, do without ado. The sage never strives for the great, and thereby the great is achieved. This passage is not easy to understand, but at least seems to confirm that the sage does act in some sense. So we can understand why one modern study of wuwei by Tongdong Bai begins with the blunt remark, probably everyone who has read the Lao Tzu carefully knows that non-action does not mean quietism or taking no action whatsoever. The question then would be what kinds of actions are ruled out by wuwei and what kinds are allowed. One popular answer, and the one embraced by Tongdong Bai, would be that the Taoists reject unnatural actions. This would fit well with attempts to connect wuwei to the cosmological themes of the Lao Tzu. It would also fit with another key idea in the text, one we've seen before, ziran, or self-so. Our early commentator, Wang Bi, writes, Tao avoids acting contrary to ziran, and so realizes its own nature. To take models from ziran means that when it exists in a square, it takes squareness as its model, and when it exists in a circle, it takes circularity as its model. It does nothing that is contrary to ziran. Following Wang Bi's interpretation, then, we can take ziran to mean being true to the nature of something. The Chinese term he uses for nature is not tian, which means heaven, or nature in general, but xing, although the Lao Tzu does not refer to it. Xing is the same word that was at stake in the debate between Mengzi and Xunzi as to whether human nature is good or bad. If, by being ziran, a person is nurturing their xing, it would require only doing what is natural for humans and refraining from doing anything more to it. Mengzi also had that view, as we saw in episode 16. He rejected Gao Tzu's position, which involved instilling rightness into human nature. To instill rightness from a source external to human nature does violence to it, just like carving cups and bowls from a willow tree does violence to the tree. What then would be an example of unnatural action for the Lao Tzu? A simple case, suggested by that advice to withdraw as soon as your work is done, would be to keep acting even though you've already achieved your goal. This may not seem very profound. Once the nail is driven into the wall, you can stop hammering. Once the cake is done, stop baking it. But in a political context, this could be valuable advice. Don't tax the people once you've raised enough revenue, for instance. Again, this admittedly rather superficial form of wuwei could find approval with the Mohists. Just think of their constant refrain that the ruler should do the bare minimum and then stop. The Taoists surely have more in mind than this, though. A major theme of the Lao Tzu is that unnatural actions are those that are aimed at fulfilling desires. The ruler should be entirely without self-interest. Staking out a position opposed to that of the notorious hedonist Yang Tzu, Chapter 13 says, "He who values the world as his body may be entrusted with the empire." And if you don't remember Yang Tzu, you can revisit episode 14, where we discussed him at length. The connection to ziran should be pretty obvious. Nature doesn't strive to be anything other than what it already is, and neither should we. Strong support for this interpretation of wuwei is found in Chapter 37, which tells us, Tao invariably takes no action, and yet there is nothing left undone, and goes on to add, simplicity which has no name is free of desires. Being free of desires, it is tranquil. Here, the nameless Tao's ability to get everything done without acting is all but equated to the absence of desire. The following chapter seems to confirm this understanding, since it connects the non-action of the virtuous person to a lack of motivation. Finally, Chapter 57 gives us a concrete idea of why this strategy could be so effective. I engage in no activity, and the people of themselves become prosperous. I have no desires, and the people of themselves become simple. We might take the point, then, to be as follows. Most of the time, rulers act with their own interests in mind. This is why they do wage wars, overtax the people, and so on. A ruler who had no motives or desires at all, no purposes in mind, would not act like that. If we make the connection between having no desires and ziran, then as far as running a country is concerned, the ruler's not pushing through his own desires is a prerequisite for the people's being able to be their natural or spontaneous selves, ziren. According to this view, wuwei and ziren are complementary. The people's ziren must be recognized and affirmed in the ruler's wuwei. The ruler's not having desires could mean that he should not try to outdo other states, since that would be a goal or desire. The Lao Tzu strongly discourages engaging in competition and states of the successful ruler, it is precisely because he does not compete that the world cannot compete with him. At this point, we can see that the Taoists are not agreeing with the Mohists at all. The limited wuwei of Mohism, if we may even call it that, is in the service of three goals that the ruler is very much aiming to achieve, namely prosperity, population growth, and order. He is relentless in his pursuit of those aims. The Taoist unrestricted and unlimited version of wuwei might wind up achieving these very same things, but if so, it will not be because the ruler has identified them as goals, as the Mohists would urge him to do. In one of the more provocative passages of the Lao Tzu, we are told that the ideal ruler treats the people like straw dogs, thus taking the same view of human affairs as heaven and earth do. The allusion is to straw models of animals that were used in rituals and then simply discarded. This is deeply anti-Mohist. Where the ideal Mohist leader would have the people's welfare in mind at all times, the ideal Taoist leader is mindful of his people's needs while at the same time giving it no thought at all. Insofar as he wants anything for his people, it is that they should be exercising non-action, just like him. They are pacified and docile with full bellies and empty minds. Full bellies because their ruler has no desires and so appropriates no resources to himself, leaving plenty to go around. Empty minds because he causes the people to be without knowledge, with the result that they are incapable of defying him. They wouldn't know how, or even be able to conceive of any reason to do so. This mirroring relationship between ruler and ruled comes up several times in the Lao Tzu, for example in chapter 58. When the government is non-discriminative and dull, the people are contented and generous. When the government is searching and discriminative, the people are disappointed and contentious. And then we have the eminently quotable and famous remark, ruling a big country is like cooking a small fish. In other words, approach the people gently so as to avoid overcooking them, which would mean provoking them into offering resistance. This is all advice a ruler could put into practice, though it remains frustratingly focused on what the ruler should not do, and rather elusive about what he should do. There's a good reason for that, which is that any determinate program of action would lead to a violation of wuwei. It would involve embracing some purpose, seeking to satisfy some desire, and identifying the steps that need to be taken to arrive at that end. A practitioner of wuwei doesn't do any of this. Instead, he reacts gently and naturally to circumstances as they arise. Hence the beautifully poetic description of the sage kings of old, who are admired by the Taoists, no less than by the Mohists and Confucians. Of old, those who were the best rulers were subtly mysterious and profoundly penetrating, too deep to comprehend. And because they cannot be comprehended, I can only describe them arbitrarily. Cautious, like crossing a frozen stream in the winter. Being at a loss, like one fearing danger on all sides. Reserved, like one visiting. Supple and pliant, like ice about to melt. Genuine, like a piece of uncarved wood. Open and broad like a valley. Merged and undifferentiated like muddy water. There's a lot going on in this complex set of images, some of which are familiar to us, the valley, the pooling water. But for present purposes, the thing to emphasize would be the hesitancy of the sage king's rule. When in doubt, they did nothing, and when they did do something, they inched forward with utmost caution. The Taoist sage king is not like the exquisitely sculpted and polished piece of jade mentioned in the Analects. Instead, he is like a chunk of uncarved wood. For the Confucians, it's the people who are like grass bending in the wind of the virtue of the sage king. For the Taoists, it is the sage king himself who bends but never breaks. What, if any, application could such ideas have today, whether for political leaders or for the rest of us? Well, the Lao Tzu may be a useful warning against something that we see all too often, that people or leaders cling rigidly to preconceived goals and ideologies. Let's consider an instructive case, the ill-fated premiership of Liz Truss in Great Britain, which was so brief that her tenure was famously outlasted by a head of lettuce. She would have done well to read the Lao Tzu before taking office. By dramatically announcing radical policies and pushing to implement them as quickly as possible, she provoked so much economic panic and political resistance that she was almost immediately deposed. Without getting into the rights and wrongs of her underlying convictions, it seems fair to say that a more cautious approach would have worked better. Indeed, almost anything would have worked better. Best of all, according to the Taoists, would be a style of leadership diametrically opposed to the one she tried, one not driven by deeply and dogmatically held principles, but one that instead gently and naturally reacts to the course of events. Finally, what about the activists of the White Rose? Could the Lao Tzu accommodate their sort of political heroism? Maybe so. Consider first a less demanding case, borrowing Mengzi's famous example of the child who is about to fall into a well. There's no reason to assume that the Taoist sage, following his policy of wuwei, would simply stand back and watch. Remember, he does whatever is natural, and in this case the natural reaction would be to rescue the child. Similarly, in the case of the White Rose, we need to bear in mind that these young students were not confronted with the ideal situation achieved by Taoist rule, in which the people are quietly going about their business while an anonymous ruler leaves them in peace. To the contrary, the Nazi leadership was violent and extremist. This was an unfolding catastrophe, a child falling into a well, but on a national scale. So, the natural response would be to refuse to conform to their edicts. What would be specifically Taoist about this would be to react naturally, without any particular plan about what may result. For all the sage knows, the child he saves will grow up to be a violent dictator. But since he is just reacting naturally and not worrying about longer-term results, that is nothing that need concern him. In this sense, what the White Rose did was also very Taoist. They remained true to themselves and their values, stating what they saw to be the truth, knowing full well that they would achieve no concrete political objective. You might say that their undertaking was, to use another word beloved of the Taoists, useless. But in a sufficiently tragic situation, the most adequate response is stubbornly passive resistance. It's better than doing nothing at all. With that, we have come to the end of our little mini-series on the Lao Tzu, commonly known as the Tao Te Ching. We'll soon be moving on to consider the other great work of Taoism from the Warring States period, the Zhuangzi, a text full of arresting and entertaining anecdotes, metaphors, and images. But before we get to that, we want to take a detour to consider another work that has a surprisingly large amount in common with the Lao Tzu, the famous Art of War, ascribed to Sun Tzu. This will help us to broaden our understanding of political action, including in military contexts, by building on what we have seen in the Mo Tzu and the Lao Tzu. That's what's coming in a couple of episodes. But we can't leave the Lao Tzu without speaking to an expert on Taoism about its mysterious and intriguing teachings. Next time, we'll speak to Robin Wang about the theme of dualist complementarity in this work and in Taoism more generally. So, do nothing until you hear from us, which will be in 2 weeks, when we release the next installment of The History of Philosophy in China.